When we started, I mentioned that we had probably a little bit proportionally more red wine than we should, and should have focused maybe a touch more on white wine. But the reason for that is I wanted to show you the diversity of the Loire. And that's going to bring us in this flight to the first wine of this flight, and it's a red. And again, it's included here because one, I think it's delicious. Two, I think it fits with our themes. And three, it offers us some of the other red wines going on in the Loire Valley. So it's actually this guy right here. Valençay is the region. Now, it's an interesting wine because it almost is like it has three names to it. Mary Taylor on the bottom, Sophie Seydoux in the middle, and then Valençay on the top. Valençay, and I have no idea if I'm saying that name right, is actually the region that it's from. And to my understanding, Valençay sits south of the Loire, still included in the area, but south of the area. Now, the reason for all these names is one that I think is actually a little typical for areas of France that maybe are country areas that don't necessarily get their wines to market very easily or international market very easily. So to my understanding, the middle name here, small one, Sophie Seydoux, is actually the woman who owns the vineyard and farms the land. Mary Taylor is actually an American, and what she does is go around, taste wine from different areas, or maybe taste fruit from different areas of France, and tries to help small producers put together wines that can be exported to the US at a reasonable price that showcase the area that they're from. Now, I can't guarantee that all of her bottles are going to be extraordinary, and I don't know her personally, so I don't know what her business plans are for the future. But what I can tell you is all of the wines that I've had presently under this label are really fun. They're great examples of the region. I think they keep their Frenchness, they keep their Loire-ness, and yet they're also really great drinking wines as well. Now, to be explicit, the reason I chose this wine is because it gives us three grape varieties that are red for us to taste in Loire, so it just broadens our experience. One of those grape varieties is Pinot Noir, and we had that before in the first flight. The other two are Gamay, and then Gamay is the second, and then the third is Côte. It's C-O-T, and it has the accent aigu, I believe, over it, and I don't know how to pronounce that. So Côte I can switch because it is actually also Malbec. It's another name for Malbec. So here we have the experience of Loire Gamay as well as Loire Malbec. Of course, completely different than Argentine Malbec and completely different than Beaujolais Gamay, but something for us to have together and experience. Now, this I would take like the Chantelouserie. A wine to be enjoyed, a wine that's meant for pleasure, a wine that's meant to be shared. And it's not necessarily a wine that wants to thrill you or alter your perspective on what the Loire is. It's just all about the fun and funness of drinking. So to me, it's an interesting combination of those three varieties. On the nose, I would believe that Pinot Noir is giving kind of the cranberry smell to the wine. The Loire Valley Pinot Noir tends to be less ripe than Burgundy, and so that would give us that higher tone cranberry smell to it. Malbec gives us just a faint touch of earthiness to the nose, and the Gamay maybe a bit of freshness in there. When we have it on the palate, it is, of course, a standard bearer of Loire red wines, meaning it's fresh and vibrant still. It's a little bit darker than our Sancerre Rouge, and that's the Malbec giving it a touch more weight. But there's still that tautness and tension that we had in the Sancerre Rouge as well. And altogether, I think it's a really harmonious wine. Again, I included it here because it aims at this tasting's goals, show you the diversity of the Loire, and also, I probably have said it too much, it's not that expensive. So a fun way to engage in Loire wines and see what they're all about. If it's a little bit too tangy and too tart, I would say it's the same recommendation. Try it with some food. Just make yourself some simple French food, even if that's just going out and buying a baguette and maybe a little bit more expensive French butter and salt. try it with this guy again and see what you think. Okay, that's actually the end of the Loire Reds that we have going on. So I wanted to take you to our big finish, if you will, Loire Whites. And I say big finish for two reasons. One is we're going to the Loire's very prime grape variety, which is Chenin Blanc. And we're also going to the Loire's really royal area to grow Chenin Blanc, Vouvray. And I mean both of those things. Chenin Blanc, well, we may not think of it we may not think of it as, say, as regal or as important as white Burgundy or Chardonnay in the United States. I actually believe it is. And I think it's one of the most dramatic white grapes that you can have. Dramatic both in the sense that the range is huge. It can be made in all kinds of ways, and it can taste in all kinds of different ways depending on where it's grown and why it's grown. It can also be sparkling, it can also be sweet and totally dry. So it's a dramatic wine in that way. The other, royalty with Vouvray, I mean that seriously as well. This Vouvray, and I'll point out the village in just a second, was once the vacation land of French kings. And so it's an area where you get very large, beautiful chateaus for the French kings. They left the stinky area of Paris back in the day and came out to the countryside to be in their palatial gardens and hang out and drink Vouvray. It may not have the fame that it once had for French kings back then, but it's certainly something I think you should explore, and it's really the king or queen variety, if you will, of the Loire. Now, Chenin Blanc is grown up and down the Loire Valley, although it stops at a certain point and gives over to Sauvignon Blanc. But we're going to emphasize just two. There are lots more for you to explore, and I encourage you to explore them, but for us, just two. Now, the first one we're going to do is actually this one. It is Domaine de Cloussel, the vineyard La Jalouserie, and it's from a village called Savinières. Now, let me put that on the map for you and then try and rationalize why we're taking you to Savinières. If we go to this area right here, we're in an area called Anjou. And just above Anjou is this place called Savinières. Now, I have to admit, Savinières is probably a rather esoteric area for us to emphasize in this tasting session. Why is that? Well, Anjou is the bigger, and also Anjou contains the Grand Cru site for Chenin Blanc as well. So we probably should have emphasized Anjou or that Grand Cru site. It's a little bit of the Waterford sense of things, though, that we love Savinières, and so for us to do a tasting of the Loire that didn't include a Savinières would be like admitting defeat. So we needed to have one, and this is a particularly special one for us to do. Now, beyond that just personal rationalization of trying to drink the best possible wine on the company dime that I can, the other thing that happens in Savinières is it is, I think, a hallmark area or a hotbed area for new ideas, particularly in viticulture. We talked about some new ideas in winemaking and viticulture with Sancerre, but with Savinières, it's actually the new ideas of viticulture that have taken off, and specifically the idea of biodynamics. This is an area where a man named Nicolas Joly has been a pioneer, and I would love to taste you on his Savinières. They are exceptionally expensive and allocated, so very hard for us to taste. And I don't think the one we're tasting is any bit inferior to his. But he is a wonderful man because he emphasized the idea of biodynamics. Now, he has a whole book out for you to read, and I'm sure you can find podcasts about him talking about biodynamics. I'll simplify it by saying it's one step beyond organic, and the idea is you look at the vineyard and quite possibly your life in it as a holistic system. So you try and look at the entire thing all at once. That brings us to this wine. I had the great fortune of meeting the winemaker and owner Domaine de Cloussel, and I apologize, it was back with the 2008 vintage, and I have lost her name in the times of glasses that I've had. But she is also a believer in biodynamics. It's kind of funny how she came about the estate. She was looking for a place to retire with the thought that her daughter would bring her family over and retire with her, and they'd work the vineyards together. Well, she, I believe, had been a nanny in England, so spoke perfect English, and her daughter had also gone over to England. Mom came back from England and bought the estate. Daughter found an Englishman and ended up staying and having more daughters and staying with the Englishman in England. So she bought this estate, and she, I think, was a slow adopter of biodynamics. There's some pretty kooky stuff going on with the idea of biodynamics that you'll hear about, and I think she was a little bit hesitant to adopt into those initially. But eventually she did. And she said the amazing thing is that now that we're biodynamic, you both feel it in the wines and you feel it in the vineyard. So for her, when she's walking the vineyards, and there are two, she can distinctly feel the presence of what's going on in those vineyards. And she can distinctly relate it to what's going on in the larger climate as a whole. Now, it's interesting to see, but I've actually done tastings with her of going through the different wines, and 6 and 8 were two that she and I, 2006 and 2008 were two that we shared together. And these were dramatically different wines. 2006 was a wine that featured quite a bit of earthiness, even though it was a white wine, and 2008 was really quite tropical as a wine. Alcohol levels were the same. So it wasn't like she was harvesting really different. And she said, this is what biodynamics expresses when you let it go and let Mother Nature take its course. So we've then, since her visit in the 6 and 8 vintage, we've since been with this winery, and it's one that I just absolutely adore. I will tell you that the wines are always a little bit wild. They're just a little bit kind of nature and of Sauvigniers. Here, I think when you smell this wine, some people, Master Soms, have told me that Chenin Blanc smells like wet wool. And while I grew up in Iowa, I don't go around smelling a lot of sheep anymore. But to me, I don't smell wet wool, but I do smell kind of an earthiness to it, almost like a cave-aged cheese, if you will, would smell, or an ash rind cheese would smell to it. There is a touch of fruit character in there, but not necessarily a whole lot, and I don't think that's necessarily the point of the wine. Then when you have it on the palate, it's a wine that delivers loads of texture, but also is very powerful, very sumptuous, and very savory as a wine. I would connect that to her winemaking, but more especially to the region that it's grown. Now, Sauvigniers also happens to be an area of a different soil type. It is the area where Brittany's soil type actually intersects with France. So if you think of the famous Brittany Massif and the cliffs of Brittany, that is actually the soil type that you have here. One of the fascinating things you can do, and we're about to do it with just 2 wines, but one of the fascinating things you could do across the entire Loire is Chenin Blanc matched with a particular soil type and see how the wine changes and its difference. With this one, I think it gives a fairly stern, fairly powerful Chenin Blanc. In fact, we're tasting it just right out of the fridge, and I would suggest that you let this warm up a little bit and see how it goes. The other thing I would say about this particular one is I would treat this wine a bit like an odyssey. Don't drink it fast. Drink it slow, because I think each glass that you take and each glass that you taste will be different than the next one. She's a believer in biodynamics, of course, and most biodynamic producers believe that their wine can be open for substantial amounts of time. The man that I mentioned before, Nicolas Joly, writes on the back of all of his bottles that he wants you to decant them 48 hours in advance of drinking them. I'm not sure I have the patience to do that because an open bottle is a consumed one in my household. But again, I would say take this wine as an odyssey of Chenin Blanc. Drink it as slow as you can. Open more Chenin Blanc if you need in order to just slow down and see how this one evolves. Now with that, that's not to shortchange our next wine at all, because here we're reaching the absolute heights of the Loire, and it's a great pleasure to present this to you, both the region and the wine. So we're going to come up and we're going to come over here, and we're going to hit Vouvray. Now there's an area to the south, Montlouis Loire, right down here, which you can find some very interesting Chenin Blanc from. It's a partner, but a different soil type to Vouvray, and we just ran out of space at our tasting. So we're going to emphasize Vouvray. Now Vouvray really is the queen of the Loire. Like I said, both because it's Chenin Blanc, the Loire's most important white variety, and also because it is where the French royalty maintained their vacation homes. Finally though, it makes magisterial, gorgeous wine of all kinds that you should explore and enjoy. And I have to point out to you that this producer, Domaine Huet, is one of the top producers in the area. Again, that's my opinion, but it's also one that was reflected in the background material. Like I said, I was researching on Jancis Robinson's website and also Hugh Johnson in her book. And this is a producer that is monumental, that they say as well, a benchmark for Vouvray and something that you should taste. Now Vouvray, if it's white, is going to be 100% Chenin Blanc, and so this is 100% Chenin Blanc. Huet, to my understanding, has 3 separate vineyards that you can choose from, so we're just having one of them, Les Hautes-Louis. So we have, at varying times in the store, multiple different vineyards going on. And the other thing is we also have multiple different sweetness levels within those. So we are actually having the demi-sec, which means that it's off dry, if you will. It has a kiss of sweetness to it. This is actually very typical for Vouvray. Now, why is it typical and what does it mean to us? Well, just like we experienced with Chinon, but even more so, Vouvray takes us further into France. So it is the big shifting region between the Atlantic climate and the continental climate. It's very variable of what could go on between those two, meaning that sometimes the Atlantic might have a greater influence or sometimes the continental might have a greater influence. And it might be for various reasons. It might be that the continental was extremely cold and that affects Vouvray's wines. Or it might be that the Atlantic was extremely warm for some reason and it affects Vouvray's wines. So it's an area of change, and the wines are going to change every vintage. That gives rise to a couple very interesting things. One is, if you're a producer, you're never really quite gonna know what you're going to harvest. Now, some producers, I think, will go in and try and standardize what they're going to harvest, meaning that they're always going to make a dry wine. They're always going to make a dry wine at a certain pH level, and so they go out and would chemically analyze where the grapes are going to come in, and they're gonna aim to hit that. And I think that's certainly possible, and really there's nothing wrong with that. Other producers, and to my understanding, Domaine Huet would be one of them, is they are going to try and let nature take its course. Now granted, winemaking has a human aspect. Someone is going to intervene and pick and going to make wine, but letting nature take its course in terms of how ripe things get, if there's an onset of botrytis or not, or maybe how not ripe things get. And with that, you're going to end up with wines that are ever changing. And then when they're in the winery, I think there's always decision-making being made at the winery of where do we leave the wine? Meaning if the wine goes and it's fermenting and it stops fermenting at a certain point, and let's say it has 13% alcohol, but yet it has several grams per liter of residual sugar still left in it. Do we then inoculate it again and force the wine to go dry, raising the alcohol but making a dry wine? or do we let the wine be? And I think for them, they let the wine be. Another thing to think about here is, let's say Mother Nature gives them a cool vintage. And so they go and, well, do we let the wine in the vineyard, the grapes in the vineyard, hang out longer to try and develop more sugar, even if they aren't developing more flavor? No, they'll go and pick it. But that means then they might have a wine that's, say, 11 or 10.5% alcohol. Do they intervene and chapitalize it and add sugar, but no further flavor? No, I think they leave it alone. This is why in Huet you're going to get such a huge variety of styles, and it's also across Vouvray why you're going to get a huge variety of styles. And I would love it and hope that I can present it in such a way that you always appreciate it for that. One of the hardships I have about Vouvray is because of that little kiss of sugar that often comes in the glass. A lot of Americans now associate that with a wine being inferior. Maybe that it's some way associated to Blue Nun Riesling and is meant for your grandma's sweet tooth and can't be dramatic wine. Love to change that impression with this video to the idea that Mother Nature made that wine the way it was, and this was a way for a wine producer to balance it out. I also have to tell you, maybe now 25 years ago, I was at a restaurant and Vouvrays were the rage. And I think they were the rage because of that little kiss of sweetness to them. Both, it was easy to drink. You know, we kind of forget about that. We love talking dry in wine, but yet we drink a whole ton of Coca-Cola, which is sweet, so we're actually drinking sweet. But back then, it was that the sweetness wasn't a problem. In fact, it helped it along. And one of the things that I would point out to you is that it went well with all kinds of food. If you think of the food of this region, of fresh salads in the spring, turbot, if you think of, say, the chèvre cheese that we've mentioned before, all of those things, but just focus on the salad with its bright lemony acidity, well, just a kiss of sugar helps the wine fit perfectly with that salad. So a great food pairing to it. And in fact, as you drink more Vouvray, you can just hold it right on through the meal and not worry about that little bit of sweetness. Because if you're having fish, or let's say you're having a roast pork and a cream sauce, that touch of sweetness will just fade away and be part of the background palate that softens everything up together. So here with this, to me, well, this Sauvignon gives you a really interesting, biodynamic, kind of wild French countryside interpretation of Chenin Blanc. Here, the regal, royal side of Chenin Blanc. On the nose, a great complexity of aromas. To me, baked apple pie, some stone fruit, also the famous limestone character of it. On the palate, it doesn't even appear to be sweet to me because the total acidity is so high that it just feels rounded and gorgeous. And again, that yellow stone fruit character comes fully through. Now, with this bottle of wine, I'll tell you, I've actually had Huet, and Huet is famous for this. Huet I've had back to 1982. Now, what you're having right now is not going to be what a wine 30 years old is going to taste like. It'll be different. But it's another wonderful place where the wines are extremely age-worthy. In fact, a couple years ago, Huet auctioned off its wine cellar, and I think they had wines back to World War I that were based on these three vineyards in Vouvray, and they were bought and consumed with great abandon. So with this, take a chance, explore Chenin Blanc up and down the Loire Valley, explore Huet, but also Domaine Clossel, and then all the other areas that I'm not getting to, but have wonderful Chenin Blanc. Again, I would point out to you that I think this bottle of Huet comes into us at under $50, and it is the benchmark reference producer of Vouvray for you to taste. One final note. Here at Waterford, if you arrive on time for tastings, we do bonus rounds, and you saw us, we were drinking this at the beginning. Vouvray, because of those climatic issues of continental, Atlantic, and things always changing, Vouvray actually makes a lot of sparkling wine. Probably the reason is that if you have a cool vintage and the wines can't get ripe enough, well, what can you do then for your production? You can turn it into delicious sparkling wine. That's one farmer-oriented vision, but I can also tell you most Vouvray producers make really fun, great sparkling wine. Another great area to explore, and we've got this on the web for you if you want to taste it. Cheers.